Hello, everyone. This is the eighth piece in this series of interviews with Miki Kashtan called Apart and Together in response to coronavirus pandemic and on what opportunities it might be offering us for creating a shift in the way we think, in the way we live, towards a life that is happily livable for all of us, for all living beings and the planet. The interviews are accompanying a series of articles Miki has been writing with the same title on her website, thefearlessheart.org. So, Miki, the title of your last article, which we will be talking on today, is Reengaging with the Full Range of Our Emotions. In the article, you point out again the fact that our modern way of living is making more and more of us unhappy, and at the same time depleting the resources of the planet in alarmingly extensive measures. And in each article, you touch on different areas of how this is happening. And in this one, you focus on the combination of patriarchal control in the form of rejecting our emotions, vulnerability, the messiness and complexity of life, and capitalism's intervention in life through structural ordering and isolation. And I guess recognizing control and isolation in our very daily lives has never been this easy, maybe in these days because of coronavirus. So this is why I think these conversations are very timely. Anyway, back to my question. And as a way out of this trap of control and isolation and unhappiness and despair as a result, you point out a leap over to a field of beyond reason and a full embracement of those non-rational elements of our human experience, which will then enable us to reconnect with choice, togetherness, and flow as the opposites in the reverse order of the core paradigm of patriarchy, scarcity, separation, and powerlessness. So, and I know there's something in this order, so I'm so looking forward to hear that one too. But to my question, why do you think it's important to integrate those non-rational elements of our nature, life's nature? And how do you imagine it to enable this shift to happen?
Thank you. So I want to start first by the significance of control to the whole project of patriarchy and specifically the Western civilization version of it. Life fundamentally is unruly. It doesn't lend itself to predict and control. It happens, it unfolds, it changes. It sometimes works, it sometimes doesn't work. It sometimes is pleasurable, sometimes is painful. And as I understand patriarchy, it emerged from a set of conditions in which there was so much difficulty for so many of us at the same time over so much time or in such intensity. I'm not even trying to narrow it. There are variations. It's not been the same in all the different places where patriarchy started, but it is an overwhelming of our capacity to adapt to life as it unfolds. And the fear that comes from that, the loss of trust that comes from that, is what led us, our ancestors, not us, but our ancestors, to begin the project of trying to control life. It's loss of trust of a deep magnitude in terms of trust in life to be able to do what life is supposed to do, which is to care for all that lives. That is what life is it's arranged to care for all that lives. But when you have an extended or deep, intense or frequent experience of that not happening, it's hard to maintain that trust. That's the inception of patriarchy. So it's easy from trying to control outside nature to move to trying to control ourselves, to see whatever is unruly in us as in continuity with what is unruly about life and having to control that. So if you look at it as the process of socialization where it's easiest, if you really look at what parents are doing with their children, overwhelmingly what parents are trying to do to their children is control them and make them do or not do things to fit something. Whatever it is in children that flows is boxed, is questions, is challenged. Don't cry, don't laugh too much. My sister was told that she was laughing too much. Um, she still carries even that simple wounding. Um, do this, don't do this. I sometimes look at families when I'm in a restaurant. It's not very often, but when I am, and I see the nature of what the parents do. And it is trying to control their children. It's this, a child. And the whole idea of socialization is fundamentally that if left to our own devices, we would be unfit for being part of a civilized world. So that's where I see that the obsession with control. I just did proofreading for my book that is coming out in a couple of months. And I noticed, and this is only like 3-4 years ago when I finished writing it, I had like 20 times in the book the phrase make sure or ensure. And I finally saw it this time. What does it mean to make sure? To make sure is to try to make the future knowable, which it can't be. And so I edited out all of those phrases. It might be too late for the designer to be able to integrate all these changes. So it might still be in the book and it's not the end of the world, but it is so deeply ingrained in us, this control. Is this addressing that piece? Is it clear enough? Do you want to follow up on that part? Because there are other pieces.
Yes, yes. So I was wondering, how do you see, embracing the full range of our emotions? How can it affect this control?
Yeah. So one of the ways, there are many things that happen in socialization. One of the ways that socialization happens is if you look at the whole range of the emotions, we get clipped from both ends. You can't be too exuberant, clip. You can't be too upset, clip. And this became particularly clear to me when I was working with people on creating an adapted feelings list for the corporate world. And where I saw two things happen. If I look at the usual feelings list, it has many more feelings on the side of what happens when our needs are not met than on the side of what happens when our needs are met. And in terms of like sociolinguistics, it makes perfect sense to me. It's descriptive of reality under patriarchy. We more often have our needs not met than met. So we need more words to describe those experiences. That's just a description. But when I adapted the list to the corporate world, it flipped. There were more feelings on the side of needs met than on the side of needs not met that were kind of like allowed within the corporate world. And they couldn't be too happy. So it's kind of like, so there was a clipping, but the clipping was more from this side than from this side. So if this is like totally neutral, you have to be close to neutral in the corporate world. But you are more allowed a little bit out of neutral in the positive than in the negative. So you will never be scared in the corporate world, but you could be concerned. You see? Um, and so that really illustrated that point for me, that it literally, we are not allowed to feel certain things. or if you do feel certain things, keep it to yourself. You lost someone, um, you're allowed X days to be in grief, and then it's time to come back to life, get over it, etc. I really appreciate the Jewish ritual around death, which is recognizes that it takes time. There is a very intensive process in the first 7 days. Then there is a process on the 30th day and a process at the end of a year. So it ceremonially marks the gradual nature of shifting from mourning back to life. But fundamentally, it's like this. So when we move outward from the clipped version of feelings, we are basically subverting the normative order of society. It's that revolutionary. Although as an individual, of course, it isn't, but that is what it does. And so if we don't do it, we remain unfree. So that's one piece of it. The other piece is deeper in terms of the process of healing, which is um, I'm thinking in particular about helplessness, which is an experience that I've thought a lot about, where helplessness is being at the mercy of others who are not doing what they would do to care for you. It's not just being at the mercy of others. You're not helpless when you're at the mercy of others if they are oriented towards your needs, which is what, as an infant, your organism expects coming into the world, that the world will orient around your needs because you are fully dependent. You become helpless when all you have is the natural order of things to be cared about, but the other people around you are not playing their part. And then you are left with need and no capacity to attend to it on your own. That's the existential helplessness of um, being born into a world in which the whole project is to tame you. We're being domesticated. So it is such an awful feeling that somewhere inside, I believe we make a decision. I will never again feel that. I will never again allow myself to feel this scared, this vulnerable, this upset, this whatever is the feeling. And that means that anytime I take any action that moves me, or even have a thought that moves me closer to that feeling, I come up against the limit that is internalized within me about what I will feel. And it limits my freedom if I remain unwilling to feel certain things. So if I inch my way more and more towards whatever the feeling actually is and allow it to myself, I expand the range of my tolerance. And when I expand the range of my tolerance, then I have more capacity to do what I know is true without worry about what will happen because I know I can tolerate it. And also in terms of the reverse order, I can just address that because I don't think I said much about it in the article. Um, the generally what I understand about trauma, which is not a huge amount, is that you exit trauma in the reverse order of the pathway through which you entered it. And so if patriarchy started with scarcity, that loss of trust, that's the big one. The separation is already a reaction to the scarcity. And the powerlessness is the loss of togetherness because we are creatures that have power through togetherness. And so if you go the reverse order, as an individual, you first reclaim, restore your choice by stepping into the willingness to face the consequences of what happens when you do, etc. And then once you have enough choice, you can embrace togetherness with other people more easily because we have more capacity to stay in choice when others don't respond to you the way that you would like. When there is togetherness, then we can restore flow through mourning and celebration in particular. Flow, this was a deep realization in the last few months when I've been thinking about it. I don't believe that we can restore flow individually because flow is um, is a state of a system, not an individual. To be in flow is to be in flow overall within a system, within an ecosystem. So there needs to be a collectivity to fully restore flow. Yeah.
Miki, you've already touched a little bit upon something I was very interested in. So when I was in graduate school and I had a political science professor who taught constitutional law and also taught about Israeli Palestinian politics. And I remember I was a TA for his lectures in that class. And he wrote a book about using reason and rationality to address the Israeli Palestinian conflict.
Good luck.
And I was like wondering about it. I was like, could we do that? You know, this was back in the early 90s. And so it touches totally upon your article, what you mentioned there. That was the path, the Greek political philosopher's way of doing politics.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just curious. And then I also noticed you said re-engaging with our emotions. So you talked a little bit about how we switched from, not engaging with our emotions anymore, but I'm wondering what led to sort of the trust that we put in reason and rationality. And then maybe how you see us like using that as the path to create positive change, how that might affect how we come out of this pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's actually quite a bit of complexity. I mentioned in the article that I wrote my dissertation on all these topics. Um, and in that dissertation, I thought of like a variety of dimensions to how we relate with our emotions that I don't mention in the article. But I just will say, for example, one dimension is whether we see emotions as positive or negative. One dimension is whether we are close to our emotions or distant from them. So, for example, mindfulness, the Buddhist practice, in some ways maintains a distance from the emotions, but uh, is completely neutral, positive about them. Um, and practices such as nonviolent communication are both close to the emotions and positive about them. So I'm not going to get through all the dimensions, and I actually don't even remember them at this point. I'm just wanting to say that there's quite a bit of complexity to how we relate to emotions. And one of the things is that when we don't have a practice of relating to our emotions, they can overwhelm us. That is actually true. And if our emotions overwhelm us, then we act in ways that other people can see as irrational and therefore justify controlling the emotion. So it is actually a cycle. The more we try to control our emotions, the less we actually develop a healthy relationship with them where we can engage with them as information, as source of wisdom, as source of clarity, rather than as direct instruction to action. So there's a lot of reaction to a lot of things, including reaction to rationality that isn't actually helpful or moving us towards more togetherness or choice or flow or any of it. Um, the whole romantic um, streak in European cultural history is also a reaction to Enlightenment rationality, but it's a reaction that it has um, a kind of pessimistic, deep, dark twist to it, rather than an embracing of the fullness of who we are. That is what is missing. Or if you look at what is happening these days in the world, um, very clearly, to me at least, the 18th century project, of which liberal democracy is one of the um, manifestations of it, that has become the normative form around the world, is collapsing. It's not delivering what people thought it would deliver. It's collapsing. There isn't an alternative that is aligned with life. So the only alternative that emerges is fascism, authoritarianism, regression to top-down control, and then people end up fighting between those two and not seeing at all the other possibility of people literally coming together to work out what to do about whatever problems we have, which is the topic of the next piece, is how do we do that? So I can see why reason would be attractive when you see life as either chaos or reason. If we give up on reason, the only other thing possible is chaos. Everything is out of control. Dog eat dog. You wouldn't want that. If you don't have a collaborative, visionary, life-affirming alternative, you would think that reason is better than anything else. So that's my sense of how it came to be valued. And and then I mean I remember one of the books that I read in school was a book by Jürgen Habermas. I think it was called something like Communicative Rationality. And it is, the way that I read it was a very, very erudite, complex, but ultimately rehashing of the basic idea that if we all adhere to reason, we would be able to work out all of our differences through clarity about who is right, basically. I'm caricaturing it. I'm doing him a bit of an injustice, but uh, I was really struck by how little room there was in that book for the emotional reality of humans. There's also this ideal that we must make decisions using reason. But in actual fact, this has been researched, people who lose their emotional capacity, the capacity to feel, people who lose the capacity to feel are unable to make even the most basic decisions, such as what to eat for lunch. They are entirely dependent on other people to make decisions for them. And they could walk you through how to make such a decision. They haven't lost their cognitive ability. This is a pro and this is a con, but the actual decision, they can't make it. And this was in a book called Descartes' Error by Antonio Damasio, I think was his name, where actual brain research shows that we make decisions not through the rational faculties, not cognitively. So how does that apply to Israelis and Palestinians? There's nothing simple about solving that problem. It would be simple. It would be remarkably simple, and I, I have an utter conviction of it. If it was possible to put on the table all the needs that are part of the situation, wherever they are, of Palestinians, of Israelis, of whoever else there is in the region, of the land, of the water, of whatever, all the needs on the table. Put on the table all the impacts of all that's happened and digest those impacts and care for them and put on the table all the available resources and then ask together the question, how do we actually deal with this in a way that cares for the most needs with the least impact, with the most efficient use of the resources? But we are completely obstructed from being able to do that and hold that together because of deep-seated wounding that both Palestinians and Israelis have, both from long ago history. There's a history of wounding on both sides, and then there's a history of wounding from each other, and then there are the power relations that make impacts different. But the people, the Israeli Jews, for the most part, don't have a capacity to hold with awareness the power that they have in relation to the Palestinians, because the history of 2,000 years of victimization and the narratives of leaders are both maintaining a sense of being victims and being scared. So all of this is there. Where are you going to bring reason into that? Who is going to listen to what with reason when there's so much going on? And it also ties into education. Children are expected to learn things in an environment that is actually assaulting their their sense of self, their humanity, that criticizes them for getting things wrong, that doesn't encourage and support exploration, discovery, multiple perspectives, and all of that. There's a right answer and a wrong answer, and you get shamed for having a wrong answer. I don't even know how any child manages to learn anything in that kind of an environment, but it would be despite of the environment, not because of the environment. So it's a similar thing. When you have intense needs that are not met, intense impacts on you that have not been acknowledged and recognized, and no pathway for having that be part of what is getting talked about. I don't have any sense that any amount of reason would help in the situation. I'm wondering if how that, yeah, I'm just curious to hear how that affects you, these ideas in relation to what you asked.
It it just, to me, it sort of saddens me because it means we have so much work to do, um, to it seems like such a heavy lift right now in the current environment
Mm,
to just be able to listen to each other, and it seems very hard to like think of being open to hearing the impact of our actions. um
mhm. Yeah,
yeah, yeah, so just sitting with that, and mourning that a little bit right now.
yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you. In these days, I am very unsure of whether and what would get us to turn around,
Mm-hmm.
both in that particular conflict and in everything.
Mm-hmm.
I, I'm 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 continuing to do the only thing that I know to do, but I don't know that it will actually work. Yeah.
Thank you, Miki.
So, Mickey, I was reading in the article about the step by step that you said we are building a network of support, learning, and love. And within families, as people work from home in COVID situation in India, there's already a lot of interdependence. And and you also said, I agree that I see it constantly that um, as we move towards connecting with our emotions in this intense reality, we will encounter patterns of patriarchal conditioning that will interfere. And I wanted to hear from you about how when they interfere, how the walking towards our emotions, difficult emotions, rather than shutting down as we used to earlier, will be helpful. And how the community, the sense of extended community, helps us when our capacity is diminished.
Yeah, you almost answered your question in full. So I will just add little bits, which is um, it's a very difficult path to exit the mainstream norms. It's a difficult path because you are first going to encounter your own internalized barriers, because we take in and internalize the messages about we shouldn't do this, we shouldn't do that, we ought to be this way or that way, I'm too much this, not enough that. All of these messages live in us. Once we manage to, you know, break free internally, then all the people around us will try to push us back to the spot that we just are trying to leave, both because we become each other's patriarchy police people, sadly. Socialization continues for the entirety of our life. We monitor each other. And also, when we move from, let's say specifically within a family, if I change how I am within my family configuration, then it almost forces other people to change also.
Yeah, yeah.
And if they don't change, then it creates much more discomfort, and they don't want to necessarily change. So it's easier to try to force me back from where I was. And then assuming that even that happens, then in society at large, there are all kinds of mechanisms of social control, ranging from not getting a job to being hospitalized in a mental psychiatric institution to being killed in some places. If you go too far, in some places, you will just be killed, no problem. So all of that, we don't think of it consciously, but all of that is on the trajectory of liberation as a possibility. So it's very difficult. If we don't have support, we're not going to be able to do it. It's going to be
Mm,
too difficult to do if we try to do it just as an individual. So in that sense, if I have even a few people around me within my extended community where we are all doing it together, or even if there are, let's say, a bunch of women friends who say, I admire you, you're so courageous, I will support you, you can come and cry on my shoulder, but I don't dare talk to my husband the way that you do. That's still support.
mm. Yeah.
Yeah. I do have one more thing to say, which is that shutting down when it's habitual allows us to function. And there is definitely a way in which, if we stop shutting down and we open to what is going on inside of us, we do lose capacity to function within the world as it is. And negotiating that is not a simple thing. I would not say in any cavalier way to everyone, oh, just do this. Don't worry about it. It's a journey. It's a journey that I want us to be in a sober place to decide whether we embark on it or not.
Yeah. You know, shutting down was easier when people would physically leave their home and go to work and then come back so that, there's that space. But now, because of COVID, there isn't that space. And
And
that's why, yeah,
yeah, this is where, in an odd way, the coronavirus is a gift, because
absolutely.
it makes it less possible to continue
Mm,
in the grooves that were there before, that were never working, but we've managed how to work with them, even while the world
yeah.
is being destroyed. And now it's even harder. Yeah.
And
Thank
one
you.
more thing I want to say is that women have raised their daughters in a different way now, knowing what they went through. And now I see in India daughters who are professionals, who are working elsewhere, are going back home to their family home because of work at home situation. And then when they see what's going on with between their parents or even the in-laws, they are raising their mothers, that you don't need to hate
Nice.
this.
I like
You
that.
don't need to hate
I
this
like that
anymore.
image.
And then the daughter is supporting the woman, the mother, and saying that, you know what, I'm with you.
That's
So
beautiful.
I
Thank
do
you.
see this point that you're making about building the new structures and also engaging with re-engaging with difficult emotions as a way of building capacity and staying open. And mourning is a big part, so I'm so grateful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And actually, Rena, I want to sort of segue from what you're describing around what people still perceive as the feminine, the idea of embracing the emotion, which also in a way stands as a remembering of what it was to be a mothering figure and to receive mothering from others. And I think I agree with you both around what COVID has done. Some of the gifts have been to remind us that there are things we cannot control. And what can keep us abreast of it is this idea of being mothered and cared for as a community. So Miki, for me, the question arises around the the emotions that lead us to mourn what we cannot control, to mourn what loss actually feels like, to take a risk around loving, because that would also invite mourning. And for those of us who continue to stay in the mainstream, so without necessarily the movement, the bold and courageous movement that you're making to live fully aligned with your values, those of us who, at least for myself, feel left behind a little bit in choice at some level, to remain with the mainstream, how do we invite this conversation around mourning, which feels so scary to so many, including myself?
Uh, First of all, the most honest thing that I will say is I don't know. In part, it's like
Yeah.
you think it's more courageous to exit the mainstream than to stay. For me, it would be more courageous to stay than to exit. Exiting the
Mm.
mainstream and living within a world that I've created for myself is much easier for me, because I never entered the mainstream. I resisted my whole life. I didn't have an alternative, but I resisted. I was called defiant and resistant and stubborn and selfish and all of those things, and it never ended. So I don't actually know. So all of it is just you know um, thinking through, in, trying to intuit. Um, and one thought that comes to mind is the more comfortable you are within yourself, the more ease there will be for those around you. So if you are struggling to embrace your emotions and you're inviting other people to do so, it's going to be much less appealing than if you look relaxed and you say, oh yeah, every day I mourn for 10 minutes. I'm just making it up.
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
for the rest of the day, I have so much more energy. Would you like to join me? Um, Somebody might say yes, somebody else might say no, and you go, okay, no problem. We'll tell you how it goes. So that's the first thing that comes to mind, is being comfortable within yourself so that you look like an alternative, not like a breakdown.
Okay.
That's one.
That would be helpful, yes.
And the another one um, is having total non-judgment, no pressure on the people who are not making the same choices that you are moving towards.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are the two things that primarily come to mind.
Um, I'm appreciating the use of the word breakdown, because in mainstream, at least my experience of it, is that being in emotion and with emotion and mourning is spoken of as a breakdown, the breakdown of something that would otherwise contain us, protect us, etc. So
Mhm.
the radical act of moving into breaking down as a way of proving to ourselves that our resilience and strength is available in that process is quite, like, I can feel it now in my body, like, yeah, breaking down, but not in that story, breaking down as in undoing.
Mhm.
I loved your word domestication, undoing the domestication of ourselves as children, as emerging adults, as growing older adults,
Yeah.
is quite profound. And the piece that I love of what you're saying, Miki, even though it's with ourselves, the invitation is to do it collectively, to do it with the other.
Mhm.
And that makes it possible. Then breaking down is a totally achievable
Yeah.
act. Thank
I,
you.
I also just want to add very briefly that there is an element of cultural dominance that exists in all of this, because all these norms that I'm talking about are much stronger in European cultures than in
Yeah.
some other cultures,
Mm-hmm.
at least some cultures that I know. And so one of the results is that people are evaluated and found deficient by people from European ancestry if they are quote unquote emotional.
Mm-hmm.
And if there wasn't a power difference or dominance, colonialism, histories of all of that, then some cultures are more emotionally expressive and some other cultures are less emotionally expressive, and that's just it. It's like, you're so weird, I can't see on your face what's going on. It's what people who come from cultures like mine that are more expressive feel in relation to the European ideal. And from the other side, it's like, ooh, wait a minute, what's going on? Why are you getting all worked up about it? That is fine, but what actually happens is that the people from the more emotional and expressive cultures get evaluated as inferior, as not fitting
Yes.
for certain
Mm-hmm.
jobs, as not fitting for leadership, etc., etc. And of course, it's also in the way that women are evaluated. So these things about emotions have deeply political ramifications as well. Yeah.
I think the last thing I want to name is that the success as defined by what has come about from rational thought, as opposed to from passion and intuition, is also part of a narrative that we've inherited. So again, the bringing back this sense of domestication is also like an invitation to explore what is the narrative around who we are as humans in relationship to our passion, emotion, life energy, and without giving up on whatever reasoning
Yeah.
capacity we still hold. So the
Right.
fact that we move from the either or paradigm, but actually integrate what we bring.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. This is why I so completely love the book Braiding Sweetgrass, because the woman who wrote it comes from indigenous wisdom and is also a professor of botany. And the result is being able to design experiments in relation to plants and harvest that knocked the socks off standard professors, but then bore out such extraordinary proof of the wisdom of indigenous knowledge. Especially the bit that I remember is that if you harvest too little, you also harm the the sweetgrass.
Mhm.
It you, and that's why if you take too much or too little, you don't support the flow. It's astonishing. The if you look at it from the perspective of knowledge, you see that it really undermines Western rationalism in a deep and foundational way.
Well, and
Yeah.
the other piece I want to say, because you just brought it up for me, is the inclusion of the subject. So the objectivity of rationality compared to the inclusion of the subject, of the us, of the we, of the I into the system as part of the only way to really gain wisdom of the system is also what I
Yeah.
remember reading from her, which is, yeah. So thank you for the reminder.
Yes. And then here's one of the fun paradoxes, which is only the European male who is granted the entitlement to being subject is entitled to objectivity. That which is object is always accused of subjectivity. It's a really bizarre paradox.
I'm from the US, and I don't, I think we're in an interesting political moment.
That's the understatement of the century.
And thinking about coronavirus and politicized reactions to coronavirus and just the amount of polarization there is, I'm really wishing for an approach, a way to relate that connects. And as I think about deepening a commitment to welcoming uncomfortable emotions or just being more in touch with the feelings in me, I'm kind of confronted with this narrative in part of the political spectrum saying your feelings don't matter, they're shamed, they're ridiculed. And I'm kind of like confused, like how can I do this and be connecting with this kind of actively negating feelings perspective?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand when you say, how can I do this? Which this?
How can I stay with the commitment to being aware of and walking towards feelings, integrating that into my being in an environment where that is really out of the mainstream?
Mm-hmm. And in a polarized political situation. I think the piece that comes to me to say in response to this is that when we regain emotional capacity, part of what comes with it is more choice about where we put our attention and more choice about which of the many feeling threads we're going to follow, to go to wherever they take us. And I would say that at a time of polarization, what I want to follow is the threads that take me to love and to our common humanity, rather than the threads that take me to separation. Because I can imagine myself getting really angry and frightened. And in certain moments, I don't get angry, but I definitely get frightened when I see certain pictures of men in arms taking to the streets and things of this nature. And yet, I can choose where I focus my attention. And if I really ask myself, what is going on? Why are people doing that? Why are people getting to this? All too easily, these people are dismissed by people who vaguely, I would say, subscribe to the values and perspectives that we hold here within our community, our not very cohesive community, but I think you know what I mean. It's easy to dismiss them as some aberration. It's a much harder discipline to dig into the knowledge that they are not different from me. Not at all different from me. They've had different life experiences, and the pathways that lead to where they are pathways that are common to humans. There's humility in that. There's embracing a kind of like heart opening, which I can choose to do the more discipline I have in relation to my feelings. It's a very odd thing. The more I embrace my feelings, the more choice I have about being with them, how to be with them, and not letting them run me, but instead be in a relationship of a dialogic relationship with my feelings, so to speak. And when that happens, I can choose to follow the thread of brokenheartedness and a sense of the tragic, rather than the thread of distance and alienation and anger. So it's much more complex than we can get into here. It's like a whole journey that we can follow softer qualities versus harsher qualities. And the softer qualities lead us to transcend the patriarchal imperative and to build bridges, at least in my heart. And you know, key and simple is my belief that fascism builds on injuries to dignity. That whether we think it's accurate or not is immaterial, and this is where reason fails. They have no reason to have a sense that their dignity is not honored. Doesn't matter. We don't feel because something is or isn't reasonable. We feel because we have had an experience. And there are big swaths of people in the world now who experience a betrayal from the institutions of liberal democracy, from the institutions of global capitalism that are so intense that they're just easy prey for fascism. So if I can do that, then I can maintain some sense of connection. Doesn't mean that I would know how to talk with them. It doesn't mean that I can then change their mind it just means some kind of humble recognition that we are all complicit in some deep way in having created this phenomenon. It's not about what's wrong with them. It's that those of us who have benefited in some ways from the existing social order have been willing to discard certain people. So their sense that they don't matter, I think, is actually not so inaccurate. And the most intense example of this is Hillary Clinton, 2016, using the word deplorable to refer to Trump supporters. I was like, when I read that back then. And I'm quite certain that every single one of the white working class men who are supporting Trump are carrying that injury to this day. Does that make sense, Inovio?
Yeah, I
Is
think
it
so.
helpful?
It is. Yeah, I'm tempted to just rephrase if I can try to integrate it. It's kind of like focusing on the feelings don't matter is almost like a red herring. Like I can
Yes.
choose to focus on what really we have in common and relating on the feelings level to what the experience is.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'm reminded of a man that I worked with once on his relationship with his wife. And when he was able 3 times in a back and forth to stay focused on her experience, just 3 times, it shifted all their fights. Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, so Miki, this is a big one for the next couple minutes, but you've given some wonderful examples in the last paragraph of your article about what some of the practices are to get in touch with our emotions, to actually have a morning practice and make agreements and build our capacity around scrutinizing our own values and taking action to change conditioning.
And so I'm just curious, like, what does Miki Kashtan do with that on a day-to-day basis? What does a day in the life look like? What are some nuggets that we could take away to integrate for our own lives?
First of all, I so don't want to be Miki Kashtan. I so want to be Miki. there's, a, there's a way that it's like that in itself has separation in it. I have a deep and profound and aching longing to just be seen as a regular human being, which I am. Um, that said, so I have a morning circle that I meet with once a week that I've been doing for several months to keep myself in it. And when I'm not connected to something in particular to mourn, I do a kind of like a morning chronology of the last week. I've cultivated very deeply the um, celebration muscles by having a daily gratitude practice that I did for a whole year that I think changed my rewiring. I can now celebrate things at any time. Mourning is more difficult for me. So I'm still in a kind of a practice. What am I mourning? What am I mourning? And so I have that, for example. Um, if I run into a challenge with a person, I won't just go, okay, it's over, no worry, let's go to the next thing. It's like, it's what happened? What, let's say somebody else does something that has an impact on me. I want to glean learning from it. It's like, what is the impact? Why did it happen? What do I learn from the impact? Um, what what led the other person to do what they were doing? What can we learn from that? And when you get into that practice deeply, you uncover so much and so quickly of where the patriarchal conditioning is, and then you can put in place practices and agreements. It's not about healing. This is something that is very hard for people to grasp the distinction. I don't anticipate that I will be able to heal everything that's ever happened to me or anyone else would ever. It's about being able to get practices that create micro bridges between where I am and where I want to be now and now and now and now. So it's a very conscious practice of deciding moment by moment where I want to put my attention and aiming most strongly to not close down. Yeah. I would say more if we were earlier, and I think that's it for the moment. Yeah.
Thank you.
So the paragraph that struck me most in your piece, Miki, was the one on shame. And as we've listened to what you said at the start, it strikes me that shame is maybe the one emotion that hasn't been clipped by patriarchy, but actually amplified for a very good reason, which is that it is very effective to control us in many different situations.
Mm-hmm.
And my question is related to a conversation that you and I had several years ago with somebody who's an activist and who saw shaming as a very key strategy, fundamental strategy to stop abuses of power from happening. In other words, if you shame the people in power who are abusing their power, then they will stop and they'll do something else and they'll go away and change will happen. So the question for me is, how do we hold conversations with people like that to help them see that actually shaming is reinforcing the very paradigm that they are trying to change?
Mm-hmm. First of all, I still don't know to what extent that conversation was successful or not. So I feel very humble trying to talk about that. Um, I do believe that personalizing it rather than remaining at the level of the abstraction of shame, um, really, really makes a difference. In other words, so you activists believe in shaming. Have you ever been shamed? And what was that like for you? And would you really want that on another person? And where is your faith? Because shaming, I think, in this context, is an expression of the patriarchal lack of faith in people's fundamental unity with life, that we wouldn't harm others unless harm was done to us first that got us out of flow, which is the fundamental premise that comes out of the work of Alice Miller, or what now is said a lot in some activist circles is hurt people hurt people. So maybe in some very narrow short run, you can get somebody motivated through shame to stop doing something, but they will wait for the next moment in which they have power again, and then they will take it out. So if you look like at Versailles leading to Nazi Germany, the Reconstruction in the US leading to Jim Crow, the civil rights movement leading to mass incarceration. There is a kind of resentment that stays with those who have been humiliated out of power that doesn't change the cycle. It just delays it and brings it back with more intensity. That is my concern about this.